Hi, it's Tim Grant.
And Nicci McLeod from the Righting Wrongs podcast.
This episode contains descriptions of gun violence, murder, and capital punishment.
Our discussion will, as always, include an in-depth analysis of how forensic linguistic techniques played a role in unravelling the truth behind these tragic events.
We hope you enjoy the show.
Righting Wrongs, an original podcast series from the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics. Series 2, Episode 1, Part 1, Derek Bentley, Death by Ambiguity.
Hello and welcome to Righting Wrongs, the podcast from AIFL, the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics at Aston University. We're all about improving the delivery of justice through the analysis of language. I'm Professor Tim Grant.
And I'm Dr. Nicci McLeod, Deputy Director of AIFL.
So Nicci, this is the big one, the Derek Bentley case. What does it mean to you as a forensic linguist? Why should we be covering it?
This case is one of the foundational cases in forensic linguistics. It's certainly among the first cases that we hear of when we enter the world of forensic linguistics. And I think if anyone's only ever heard of one forensic linguistics case, it's probably this one. Became aware of it, I think, myself as a master's student when I was lucky enough to have Professor Malcolm Coulthard guest lecture on my course. And that's where I heard about it. It's one of those really well-known miscarriages of justice, and we've talked in Series 1 about the abolition of the death penalty for murder in this country and how there are certain key cases that kind of led to that change. So we're talking about the burglary of a warehouse where the police attended and one of these police officers was fatally shot. And he was fatally shot by a man named Christopher Craig, but it was Derek Bentley, his accomplice, his companion anyway, who was actually executed for this crime. So he was found guilty of murder and he received the death penalty. Chris Craig was underage at the time, couldn't receive the death penalty, whereas Derek was old enough to do so. So it's one of these three cases, as we said. We talked about Timothy Evans before, we mentioned Ruth Ellis, and Derek Bentley is the other kind of big one in that sort of big three. I've actually visited Derek's gravestone in Croydon.
Yes, I remember you saying on your McLeod's murder tours.
McLeod's murder tours, yes, absolutely. So down in Croydon, we found his grave, and there's a quite moving epitaph on the grave, which is his sister Iris campaigned and fought very hard to have that included on the gravestone. It says, "Here lies Derek Bentley, a victim of British justice," which is really quite poignant and I think distills quite a lot of the problematic nature of, lots of the kind of complexities of this case, which we're going to be discussing over the next two parts. So what about you? When did you come across the Bentley case?
Very similar, is sort of at the point of getting interested in forensic linguistics. Again, I heard Malcolm Coulthard speak, and he will be joining us for the second of this two-parter.
Yeah.
So he'll be joining us for the next episode. But I was a student of Malcolm's in 1998, which is when the final appeal was heard when Derek Bentley was pardoned. There was a bit of a buzz about that at the time when I was a PhD student in Birmingham. Earlier than that, just as when I was a master's student, there was quite a famous film starring a very young Christopher Eccleston, a brilliant film called Let Him Have It from 1991. So if our audience like film recommendations, in the UK, it's currently playing on Channel 4. So I rewatched it as part of my preparation for the podcast. It's both gripping and horrifying, and we've already said, this doesn't end well for Derek Bentley, and it takes you on that journey. But it's a very, very strong film, and recognising two things. First of all, it's a fairly familiar story, this miscarriage of justice. So most of the people in 1991 who were watching the film would have known the ending. Derek Bentley was indeed executed. He was hanged. And I watched this with my 19-year-old son, George, who in fact has done the artwork for our podcast.
Yes.
And he didn't know the story. And he's a film student. He's studying filmmaking. So to discuss it with him was great, in fact. But in prepping the podcast, as well as watching the film, I've obtained all sorts of secondhand books mostly from the 1990s when the miscarriage of justice element was reaching a new fever pitch. It reached a fever pitch in the 50s at the time, in the 60s, and it rumbled on and so on. But this Iris campaigning for his final appeal had impact sort of socially and in the world of media. And a set of books came out about that time, campaigning books. And so I've been rereading those or reading some of them for the first time. And I've learned lots by doing that research, and not least of which some of the characters from our Timothy Evans episodes reappear. So when we talked to Kate Summerscale about her book on the Timothy Evans affair. She sent us that book around the journalist Harry Proctor.
Yeah.
And he has a large role to play in the Derek Bentley case, which I hadn't realised before.
Okay, and I think you've got an interesting story to tell about his involvement here.
This whole case is riven through with supposition and anecdotes and who do you believe. But Craig's defence barrister is a man called John Paris. And his book, Scapegoat, has some really interesting stories about Harry Proctor. So on the night that they were convicted, Harry Proctor had bought Chris Craig's story from the family. They had paid the family lots and said, we'll have your exclusive story for the Daily Pictorial newspaper that's now the Daily Mirror. And so he whisked them away to a hotel. He whisked Craig's mother and father and an older sister, Lucy Craig, away to the hotel to get them out of the way of other journalists also vying for this story. And according to John Paris, at least, in the middle of the night, Chris Craig's father was hammering on Lucy Craig's door, where her and Harry Proctor had hooked up for the night.
Oh, goodness.
And Harry Proctor ended up walking along a window ledge to his own bedroom to escape Chris Craig's father. So the journalistic ethics of the 1950s and into the 60s are possibly suspect. And also, interestingly, Paris suggests that the last letter that Bentley wrote to his family from prison was in fact penned by Harry Proctor. Now, if any of our student listeners want to do an authorship analysis, there may be the data to do that. But as we're going to hear in the next episode, there's a very strong suggestion that the words of Bentley's confession statement are not Bentley's words. And if the words of this crucial final letter are not Bentley's words, where's Bentley in this story?
Yeah, we don't hear his voice.
And that's why we've called our second episode, the episode that's coming up, we've called it Let Him Say It. And so we want to hear perhaps or discover between the words what Bentley might have said himself.
Yeah, exactly. So we're doing part 1 now, Death by Ambiguity, we're calling this, because probably one of the more well-known aspects of the case is this alleged statement that Derek made on the roof prior to the shooting of the police officer Sidney Miles, which was "Let him have it, Chris." We've got the film named after it. And there's questions around what did he actually mean by that. So we're going to be kind of exploring that. But there's also ambiguity around the meaning of what it is to be held. And we're going to be getting into that as well. So we're talking about legal versus ordinary meanings. So, to hold something or to hold someone for you and I means one thing. But then you've got to kind of look at what the legal meaning would be, which would be under arrest, essentially. And so there's a lot of questions around that and about what was meant and what did Derek understand it to mean while he was giving his evidence. And this contributed really to his failed appeal. And then, as you've mentioned, we're going into part 2, which we've called Let Him Say It. And this is where we will be speaking to Professor Malcolm Coulthard about his role in the 1998 appeal. And this is very much focused on the alleged confession of Bentley, certainly his statement anyway, and the contents of that and the contributions that a linguistic analysis can make into evaluating evidence of this nature and what Malcolm's opinions were there. So really throwing doubt on the legitimacy of the confession statement and therefore on the conviction. Now, for our case file, we usually sort of put something together about giving our outline in the facts of a case, but this time you've picked a particular text to use for the case file. Why is that?
I've picked the inside flyleaf of the book by Francis Selwyn, which is in 2 editions. The main part of the text are exactly the same words, but the hardback is called Gangland. The softback is called Nothing But Revenge. Interestingly, the title of the softback version of the book, I bought both thinking they were different books. The softback version of the book comes from the words of Albert Pierpoint, who was the last British public executioner and hangman. And he hanged not only Derek Bentley, but Timothy Evans, John Reg Christie, who appeared in our first 2 episodes of Series 1, Ruth Ellis, and many, many more people. And the title, Nothing But Revenge, actually comes from an interview that Pierpoint gave. And I think we've got an extract of that interview voiced up by our producer Sam now.
I do not now believe that any one of the hundreds of executions I carried out has in any way acted as a deterrent against future murder. Capital punishment, in my view, achieve nothing except revenge.
Going back to our film recommendations, there's a great film about Albert Pierpoint starring Timothy Spall. He was quite a character. He was, as you said, the last executioner in this country. But obviously he would go off and do that when he was required to, go off and carry out an execution. And for the rest of the time, he was a jovial pillar of the community landlord at his pub back in Oldham in Greater Manchester.
Yeah. As we could tell from Sam's accent.
Yes, if we can tell from the accent, yeah. His pub was called Help the Poor Struggler.
Oh.
Yeah. It's not there anymore. It was demolished, I think, to make way for building the M62. Is that the right area for the? Yeah. So it's no longer there. Which obviously, if it was, it would be on MacLeod's murder tours. So as you know, it's been demolished. So yeah, he was amazingly efficient. It seems a strange way of putting it, but the way that he carried out his work, I mean, in order to sort of minimise the distress on the condemned person, what he'd do is enter the cell of the condemned person very early in the morning with his assistant and a guard, collect them from their cell, take them over the trapdoor, which is where he had the noose set up, put the noose and a hood over their head, release the trapdoor, and the time that it took him, the average time it took him from entering the condemned person's cell to dropping the trapdoor was 12 seconds.
Brutally portrayed in that 1991 film, Let Him Have It. I mean, you said it's sort of meant to be merciful, and it sort of is, but it's also utterly brutal, that sequence in the film. That's the name of the first Selwyn book, the paperback version, Nothing But Revenge, comes from the words of Albert Pierpoint. His other book, the hardback book, which is in fact the same book, there's a nice trick there. Maybe we as publishers should try this.
Yeah.
Because you get someone to buy two. I mean, both of them second hand at £3.50 each or something. So I don't think anyone's making money off it. But I felt that the flyleaf of the hardcover book really exposes, even in the early 90s, the sensationalist reporting of this case. It's not just another criminal case. It occupies a sensationalist space, a bit like the Timothy Evans did. As Kate Summerscale's thesis is that the Evans case was as much about the media as it was about capital punishment. And so for the case file, we've got the flyleaf of this book. There's no bigger case of wrongful conviction in British justice. Let's open the case file.
Gangland, the case of Bentley and Craig. On the evening of the 2nd of November 1952, a shot fired from a makeshift weapon on a warehouse roof in Croydon killed PC Sidney Miles. Next morning, the newspaper headlines proclaimed to Chicago gun battle in London, gangsters machine-gunning armed police over the rooftops. But the trial of Bentley and Craig affronted common sense and alienated a generation raised in the post-war suburbia of cinemas, coffee bars and drab streets. How could Derek Bentley, 19 and mentally subnormal, be hanged for a murder committed a quarter of an hour after he was arrested? Lord Chief Justice Goddard and the Home Secretary, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, found a way. The nation was split into those determined to teach young thugs a lesson and those dismayed by an act of judicial murder. The execution of Bentley, wrote Kenneth Alsop in Picture Post, caused an emotional upset in England comparable only to Dunkirk and the death of George VI. Gangland evokes the high drama of those weeks in the autumn of 1952. The moral authoritarianism of the Churchill government was backed by Lord Goddard's zeal for hanging and flogging, by women's groups demanding tougher sentences, and corporal punishment by a popular press which portrayed society under threat from cosh boys and teenage gunmen, flick knives and horror comics, violence on the cinema screen and the printed page. Against this, the demonstrators packed Whitehall, chanting "Bentley must not die." Others pointed out that violent crime was falling rather than rising. Bentley went to his death and thereby perhaps did more to discredit capital punishment than anyone. The facts of the case, including hysteria over sex and violence in the media and the clamour over rising crime which helped to ensure his execution, have a relevance to all periods of history, not least our own.
So let's start off then by introducing these two young men, Chris Craig, Derek Bentley. Christopher Craig was the youngest of 9 children. He was brought up in a good lower middle class family. Chris Craig's father was a bank cashier. He'd served abroad in the First World War and he'd served in the Home Guard in the Second World War. He was, by all accounts, an excellent shot. In sort of shooting competitions, he was recognised as the 4th best shot in the British Army. And he also taught his sons to shoot. Chris was fairly well educated, but he was dyslexic. His siblings actually went to a paid-for grammar school, but because of the dyslexia, Chris didn't do well in his exams. He was considered intelligent, he was considered very quick-witted, but obviously the dyslexia posed a sort of certain problems when it came to achieving well in exams. So his sisters would read to him, and they were still sort of reading him bedtime stories even when he was kind of 14, 15 years old.
Yes, the bedtime stories point came up in the trial, and it's sort of against the media portrayals of young cosh boys and gangsters. His sisters were reading him Enid Blyton.
Yeah.
And things like that. So there was a clash of perception.
Seems very wholesome.
But Chris also, he collected guns. And it turned out that by the time of the shooting, he had possessed in his time between 40 and 50 different weapons. And he would take guns to school and swap them with other boys. And this was, according to the sources I've been reading, moderately well known amongst certain groups in London. It was just post-war. Guns were relatively easy to find. A lot of them were non-functional. And there was a sort of a subculture of teenage boys owning, acquiring and swapping guns, sometimes adapting them and so on. He might have been more unusual in that his friends knew that he would often carry a gun on his person, and sometimes a gun adapted so it would fit into his pocket. He also possessed ammunition and would re-engineer the ammunition and the gun. So he would pad out ammunition to make it higher caliber, and he would file down live ammunition, and he would attempt to fire the guns. A lot of the guns wouldn't fire, but it must have been fantastically dangerous work trying to make these real guns fire after a period of sort of inactivity and certainly not being well kept.
On 14th of March 1952, Christopher's older brother, Niven Craig, with 4 others, broke into a house in Waltham Abbey, which is north of London, and carried out a domestic armed robbery. They came away with just £4, which is the equivalent of around about £147 into today's money, so not a huge haul. At the time, Niven was 26, and it was never proved, but it was suspected that Chris, who at the time was 15, was one of those accomplices that he had been involved in that armed robbery too. On October the 30th, 1952, later that year, Niven Craig and another man were convicted of housebreaking and armed robbery, and they were sentenced to 12 years imprisonment. And by all accounts, Chris didn't take this well. He took this really hard. He was very angry. He was very embittered at the fact that this had all happened to his older brother. And it was just 3 days later, on the 2nd of November, that he opened fire.
So that was Chris Craig's background. Derek Bentley's family came from a sort of lower strata of society. So as you've said, Chris's parents paid for some of their children to go to a grammar school, a high achieving school, although not Chris himself because he didn't make it. But Derek Bentley's family was very much from a sort of a working class rather than an aspirational middle class family. He shared a bedroom with his uncle, which is maybe one signifier of that. And his father ran a small repair workshop out of the back of his house. So it wasn't sort of a wealthy family by any means. And he had 2 younger siblings, Iris and Dennis. Aged 3, Bentley had been playing in the street. He had been climbing up a lorry, or a truck, I guess, and had landed on his head. And after this accident, he suffered fairly frequent epileptic seizures. But also during World War II, the house that Bentley lived in with his family had been bombed. And the bombing caused Bentley to be trapped in the rubble for a period of time, leaving him with serious head injuries and concussion. And in fact, a sister had died in a previous bombing as well. So the family had suffered from the Blitz in the Second World War.
Yeah, so he's had this fall. He's been in a building that was bombed. But whatever the cause of it, Bentley today would be described as having learning disabilities. There's no getting away from that. IQ tests, and we know they're problematic, but he was assessed in 1948 where his IQ was scored at 66. And then in 1952, it was scored at 77. And of course, the average IQ is 100. So he was below average IQ-wise, and he had a lot of problems in that area. In the language of the day, he was described as mentally defective, borderline feeble-minded. At the time, that was considered a kind of scientific definition, although obviously not the sort of language we would use today. This status was defined as 3 standard deviations below the average IQ. So he was in the bottom 0.1% of the population. Other assessments pointed to him having a reading age of 4 and a mental age of 11. And in February 1952, he was assessed for national service, but he was classified as unfit because he was mentally substandard, and so he became unemployed because he was not fit for service. After this incident, which is at the heart of what we're talking about today, Derek couldn't accurately spell. He couldn't write out his first name, so he couldn't sign the witness statement.
And that's going to become important later because there are multiple signatures on the witness statement which are fluent, and then there's one with his misspelt first name. So, and he couldn't have read the statement anyway.
No.
They were growing up in a similar part of London, and Bentley's family were, before the incident, worried about Craig's influence over Bentley, in spite of the age difference. So Bentley, by this stage, was 19 and Craig was 16, but it was clear that Craig was influencing Bentley, not the other way around. And in fact, Derek's father had asked the police for help in keeping Chris Craig away from Derek Bentley, but the police had told them there was nothing that they could do. So Craig had been around before, and on one occasion, close to the events of the robbery, had shown Derek's mother a knuckle duster with a spike on his side that he was proud to have made himself. Okay. And she said that he should throw it away, it would get him into trouble and so on. We've got a record of what Chris Craig said in response to her concern.
Craig replied, "A fat lot I care for the police. They're a lot of bloody fools. We don't like the police, see? They've just given my brother Niven 12 years. Do you think I'm going to let them get away with that? I'm going to get my own back someday. And how? They'll never take me alive."
Okay, so we can hear from that the anger that Chris has about Niven Craig's sentencing, which, as we've said, was on the 30th of October. And then we come to the evening of the 1st of November. And Chris knocks on Bentley's door to call for Derek. He's sent away by Bentley's mother after this knuckle duster incident. And this is apparently without Derek's knowledge. Derek is sat inside watching TV.
So Derek's mum thinks Chris is bad news, and so she sent him packing. So what Chris did was retreat to the street corner, and he got 2 other boys that he knew, Norman Parsley and Frank Fazy, very well presented grammar school boys, and when he thought they stand a better chance of getting past Derek's mum than he did. So Bentley's mother indeed approved and called Derek and said, you can go out with these 2 boys. Now, the reason Chris had called is because Derek had come up with a plan for a robbery. He'd pocketed some keys to a butcher's shop the day before, and he told Chris about that and asked him, did he want to come and rob the shop with him the next day? So that Sunday evening, the weekend's takings would still be there in the shop, waiting to be banked on the Monday. So this was the idea, to go into the butcher's shop and see if they could get these takings. So they took the bus towards the butcher's shop, which was in South Croydon. Bentley had a knife with him, and Craig also showed him that knuckle duster, the one that he showed to Derek's mum. Now, we don't know for sure whether Derek knew it, but Chris Craig had a Ely .455 revolver on his person. He'd sawn most of the barrel off. As we know, big gun enthusiasts like to modify them and so on. So he'd sawn most of the barrel off. It would fit in his pocket. And he also had some of his home-tooled ammunition that we heard about before.
By about 9 o'clock at night, we've got to now, and they reached the butcher's shop. But when they got there, it was occupied. There were lights on inside, and so the plan had been to enter an empty shop and steal the takings, but that wasn't possible, so they decide not to go in. They sort of scout out a couple of further places. They go further down the road, and they size up a sort of an electrical store. But apparently was a courting couple. That's very elegant, isn't it?
Nice
a courting couple in a doorway. And so they felt they would be observed. And it seems at some point in this scouting expedition, Chris Craig had taken over. He was sort of improvising in a way that was perhaps beyond Bentley. He stopped them at a warehouse of the Barlow and Parker Confectionery Company, which was all dark.
I've been there.
Of course you have. Nicci's been there on her murder tours.
MacLeod's murder tours, one of the stops on the way up to see Derek's grave, really. We stopped off at the location of Barlow and Parker's Confectionery.
Is it still a warehouse?
It's not still a warehouse. It's now houses. So if you live on Tamworth Road in Croydon and you saw somebody standing outside taking photos of your house, to apologise.
Okay. So what happens next is Chris takes the lead and climbs over a side gate and up some drain pipes onto a sort of a flat roof. And although it's a flat roof, there's a lot of sort of skylights. There's a stairhead, so a brick structure where the stair comes to the surface, and other sort of obstacles on the flat roof. And there's a little parapet and a railing around it. Now, Unknown to Chris and to Derek, on the other side of Tamworth Road, a 9-year-old girl was watching them out of her back bedroom window. And she'd called to the parents, and her father ran down to the local phone box, because there weren't mobile phones back in the 1950s, and called the police.
And the police arrived fairly quickly. They were there within 5 minutes of the call. It was Detective Sergeant Frederick Fairfax. So he was in plain clothes, and then there were 3 police constables in a van. As well as those 4 police officers, we also had Police Constable Sidney Miles and James MacDonald, and they were in one of what was described as a wireless car. So this was quite a new thing at the time. It's a police car carrying a radio. And the designation and radio call sign for this car was 7Z.
I've done quite a lot of research, and I went down a rabbit hole with this, and I cannot prove this, but I want the call sign of this being a Z car to have informed the TV series Z Cars, which was launched shortly afterwards. But there's no historical evidence to back up that speculation, sadly.
Let's say it is. So Police Constable Miles went to find the key holder, so he needed to gain access to the building. Detective Sergeant Fairfax climbed the drain pipe up to the roof. Didn't know where these intruders were that had been reported, so Police Constable Harrison climbed up a different roof, the roof of a neighbouring building. And Fairfax shouted out into the dark, saying that, identifying themselves as the police and saying that the place was surrounded.
Yeah, and at this point, Craig replies, "If you want us, fucking well come and get us."
So Fairfax rushes them, grabs Bentley, and then he's trying with the other hand to kind of lunge for Chris Craig. And he says, "I've got one," as in he's got hold of Derek. And he's shouting that over to Harrison. So this is the one that's gone up onto the neighbouring roof. He says, "I've got one." And Fairfax, so he's holding Bentley and he edges round the raised stack on the roof. This is the point at which 3 police witnesses said under oath that they heard Bentley shout, "Let him have it, Chris." So the 3 police witnesses we have to this are Fairfax, who's got hold of Bentley, Harrison, who's on the roof next door, and PC MacDonald. Now, this is a police officer who was halfway up the drain pipe trying to reach the main rooftop, claims to have heard this being shouted.
Okay, so as we'll hear, there's some dispute about timing of the shout and what followed, and sequencing, and indeed whether Bentley ever said, "Let him have it," at all. But the police account is that immediately after the shout, Chris Craig fires his first shot. Fairfax claimed that Craig shot him from about 6 feet away. Craig says that he was over 30 foot away from the other side of the roof. But what's not disputed is that first shot hit Fairfax, a glancing blow on the shoulder. It barely drew blood, and the bullet, in fact, was caught in his braces that were holding up his trousers.
I should say for American listeners that by braces we mean suspenders that hold up trousers rather than teeth correcting equipment.
Okay. Yes, thanks for the translation. So Craig has fired this shot that hits and lightly wounds Fairfax. Fairfax was spun round and knocked down by a blow to his right shoulder, but was relatively unhurt. He picks himself up and immediately grabs Bentley again. So although he was knocked down by the shot, by the shock of it or the force of it, he grabs Bentley immediately and punches him, and Bentley falls to the ground. And
Fairfax says, "I pulled him up in front of me as a shield." It is at this point that he searched Bentley, and he took this knife, which we heard about before, and he took the knuckle duster. There's no struggle from Bentley, but gets Bentley into the cover of the staircase entrance, so this sort of raised bit on the roof. Craig then fires at least a couple of shots at Harrison, who's on the other roof.
By this stage, so the police have turned up with sirens, there's shooting being heard, and Tamworth Road was filling up. So the fire brigade had arrived with ladders to aid access to the roof. There were ambulances. Because shots had been fired and this had been radioed back, armed police were on the way. And fantastically, the local pub across the road was called the Robert Peel, which is, of course, where we get the policing name the Bobbies from, because Robert Peel was the founder of the British Police. Mm-hmm. So out of the local pub, the Robert Peel, there were a lot of onlookers to see what was going on. Well, there was this gun firing on the roof above, and the police were obviously concerned to keep the crowds back. And basically, you've got chaos. And into this chaos, PC Sidney Miles comes back with the key and the key holder, and is able to access the staircase and runs up to the roof with Harrison behind him.
So he kicks the door open and steps through out onto the roof, and he was immediately shot just above the left eyebrow, and he fell dead. Now, Harrison jumps forward to help, and then Chris Craig fires again and misses. A further policeman, PC Jags, has climbed the drain pipe at this point. So there are 4 policemen alive on the roof at this stage.
Fairfax and Harrison then go to take Bentley down the stairs because the door's now open and they're able to do that. Craig fires again, shouting, "Come on, you brave coppers, think of your wives."
And Bentley comments, "You want to look out, he'll blow your heads off." And then as he's taken down off the roof, he says, "They're taking me down, Chris."
Fairfax returns to the roof, having been issued with a revolver, and shouts, "Drop your gun. I also have a gun."
And Craig replies, "Come on then, copper, let's have it out. Are you hiding behind a shield? Is it bulletproof? Are we going to have a shooting match?"
Fairfax runs out, firing towards Craig.
And Craig tries to fire back, but the ammunition fails him. And the police officers hear the kind of dry click as he's sort of pulling the trigger of the revolver several times. Craig stands on the parapet of the roof and he shouts, "Well, here we go, give my love to Pam," and jumps headfirst off the roof of the warehouse. And his fall is broken by hitting a wooden and glass greenhouse below. Police on the ground jump on him immediately and he's heard to say, "I wish I was fucking dead. I hope I've killed the fucking lot." He'd fractured his spine and his breastbone and his wrist, but he was alive.
So that's that. That's some story. And as we've said, the next day the papers have a field day. The Daily Mail kind of lead the charge, can be depended on with their headline, "Chicago Gun Battle in London. Gangsters with machine gun on roof kill detective."
It's nice and calm. Isn't
Yes.
it?
And other papers have similarly lurid headlines.
Craig was taken to hospital in an ambulance and Derek Bentley was taken directly to a police station where about 5:30 a.m. he was said to have dictated and signed a statement which we're going to focus on in the next episode of the podcast when we talk to Professor Malcolm Coulthard.
We're going to examine a little bit the initial trial and the early appeal that occurred immediately after the trial. And we've called this episode Death by Ambiguity. And there are 2 ambiguities that were addressed at Bentley's first trial. The resolution of these ambiguities contributed to him being sentenced to death, and this is their importance. So the first ambiguity is the one that listeners may already be aware of, and it's the famous shout, "Let him have it, Chris." And this is well discussed at the trial and put before the jury to some degree. What does this mean? The second, less known ambiguity concerns the issue of Bentley being held under arrest at the time that PC Miles was killed, and what held might mean in this context. And these are good for us to discuss as a pair of ambiguities because the legal and linguistic points about them somewhat contrast with the other, and it allows us to get into who determines the meaning of phrases in court cases like this and when they come to court. So let's start with "let him have it." The first controversy is, of course, whether he said it at all.
Yes, so as we heard, 3 police officers swore at the trial that they had heard it.
Fairfax. As we got to the bottom of the left-hand corner, Bentley broke away and shouted, "Let him have it, Chris." There was a shot, a flash, and I felt something strike me.
So MacDonald, he didn't identify that it was Bentley who said it. He implied there was a gap between the utterance and the gunshot. Let's hear from him.
Can you give me some idea of how long it took you to get down the drain pipe after you heard the remark, "Let him have it, Chris," before you heard the shot? Not very long. The top foothold of the drain pipe was sloping down. The 2 pipes coming out the main pipe was sloping away. And once I got my feet in that, I was down very quickly.
And Harrison, we don't have his words from the trial, but this is what John Paris, who was Craig's defence barrister, said about Harrison's evidence.
The next witness to say that he had heard Bentley use the words, "Let him have it, Chris," was PC Norman Harrison. Comment has already been made on his extraordinary agility in going round to the back of the premises, over a fence, onto the roof of the factory at number 25 Tamworth Road, down again to the ground, into the garden of number 26, through the house, back into Tamworth Road to the front of the factory, back again somehow into the garden of number 26, up onto the factory roof, and then along it to near the chimney stack. His ability to see everything that happened from there, a distance of over 60 feet from the lift shaft, on a night so dark that Fairfax could not see the 2 youths until he was upon the roof, with the lift shaft obstructing his line of vision, was equally remarkable. As was his sense of timing. He claimed he was there before Fairfax got onto the roof and both saw and heard everything that happened. In cross-examination, he claimed he saw Fairfax actually climb onto the roof up the vent pipe, although his line of vision from the chimney stack was obstructed both by the 4 roof lights and by the stair head. He was absolutely positive, he said in his cross-examination, that he had heard the words used by Bentley.
So it sounds like we've got some questionable accounts there potentially from those
Three police witnesses swear to it in court, Nicci. I'm not sure what you're saying.
Okay, nothing. What did Bentley and Craig have to say about this?
Bentley's statement was given just before dawn, sort of the following morning, and there's no mention of the shout, "Let him have it," in Bentley's statement. As we've said, we'll focus on that statement in the next episode. And at trial, he denies having ever said it. Craig also categorically denies that Bentley said it, and we've got this extract from his cross-examination.
He has told us he came and grabbed Bentley, and while you were all together by the head of that lift shaft, you deliberately shot him? I did not, sir. Having been incited to do so by Bentley saying, "Let him have it, Chris," are you saying you did not hear that? Bentley did not say it, sir. 3 officers heard it in the darkness from different points of the compass. Are you saying he did not say it? I'm saying I did not hear it, and if they heard it, they have better hearing than mine.
So we have that complete clash. So Bentley and Craig deny that it was said at all, and we've got 3 police officers swearing they heard it, and that it was 2 of the 3 are swearing that they heard Bentley shout the words. What do you think, Nicci?
Well, Chris Craig, he did a lie detector in 1991 for a TV show where he said he didn't hear it and the lie detector showed him to be telling the truth. But what kind of stock do we put in lie detectors?
Maybe that'll come up in another episode. So I believe they're basically stress analyzers.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of people who will not be stressed lying, and there's all sorts of people who'll be stressed for other reasons than lying.
Yes.
And so I pinch of salt for a lie detector.
Absolutely, pinch of salt. Yeah.
Do you have a view? Where would you come down?
Well, I think with the likelihood of those 3 statements, particularly the one that was from the police officer that was sort of so far away and moving around, and the darkness of the thing, he couldn't really have told where anything was coming from. It doesn't seem particularly likely that all 3 would have heard exactly the same thing given those circumstances.
So you're skeptical at best, and part of that is that all the 3 police officers saying exactly the same story.
Yes.
Makes it less likely to be true rather than more likely to be true.
It makes it less likely to be true, yeah. And quite a short string of words, isn't it? Let them have it, Chris. But still, for all 3 of them to report it identically, and we know we're quite bad at remembering exact words when we've heard them. I mean, we're good at remembering the gist of things, but you might expect there to be a little bit of variation if these were 3 true accounts, and it sounds a bit more like they potentially may have collaborated on that. What about you, Tim? What are your views?
I'm sort of similarly sceptical. John Paris is pretty good on this stuff. Again, he was Craig's defence barrister, and you've got to bear in mind that he builds his whole career as being a sort of anti-establishment defence barrister, and he became a Labour MP, which in those days was anti-establishment.
Yeah.
And he cites Mr. Justice Travers Humphreys, which is a fantastic name, who says, "1 police officer may tell the truth, but 4 or 5 never do." That's corroboration of your scepticism. And Paris himself describes the prosecution cases as neat and tidy as a well-rehearsed play. And he also runs a really interesting line of argument, which was considered in the 1998 appeal. And so he points out that there is a standard police law book which was provided into every police station in the land. And this is called Moriarty's Police Law. And the only case they have on joint liability, joint enterprise in that book, which is what this would be. So Craig shot the police officer. There's no dispute about, well, there is some dispute about that, which we may come to. But the case is that Craig shot the police officer and Bentley's guilt is by association. And this is joint enterprise law. And there's a case in that book, the only case about joint enterprise in that book is R.V. Appleby. And Appleby, the defendant in that case, had been involved in a warehouse robbery. His co-defendant had shot a police officer just after Appleby had shouted out the words, "Let him have it. He's alone." So that's there in the police manual under joint enterprise. And on this basis, Appleby was found guilty of joint enterprise and hanged for his part in the crime. And so Paris points to this police textbook on law, and he certainly believes that this is where the phrase comes from. So he thinks it's completely fabricated. Of course, the bottom line is we don't know, but in court, this wasn't actually strongly questioned whether it was said or not. So we have to believe that the jury thought that Bentley did indeed shout these words and then decided on what those words meant and whether they provided evidence of this joint enterprise.
And then presumably jury wouldn't have known about this police textbook where an identical scenario, an identical phrase.
That's right. And Paris is a little critical of Bentley's defence barrister for not raising this. He does recognise that the defence barrister is sort of caught in a trap between going all out and accusing the police of lying and rather making the evidence fit and so on. And so, but he's a bit critical that this isn't raised.
But assuming he did say it, then what does it mean? Let him have it, Chris. What are our possible meanings here?
So just to state it explicitly, there's two potential meanings here. One would mean, Chris, give the police officer the gun. And the other would mean, Chris, shoot the policeman.
Yeah.
Let him have it, Chris. It could mean either of those two things. And this was raised for the jury to decide on as a point of fact in the original trial. But as I've said, Castles, Bentley's defence lawyer, couldn't get too far into the point of ambiguity just because Bentley had denied it being uttered at all.
Right.
So you can't. It's quite hard to make the case. He didn't say it at all, and if he did say it, it meant this. Yeah. Didn't argue it strongly before the jury. Other evidence which would become important in the case, because if it means Chris, shoot the police officer, then that is Bentley inciting and being an accessory to the crime, participating in the crime. It counts as joint liability, joint enterprise. And other relevant evidence to this is whether Bentley knew Chris had a gun and perhaps meant to use it to harm in advance of Chris Craig firing the shot. We're going to get into that in more detail in the next episode, that what Bentley knew about the gun in advance. The key point here is just that such disputes of what someone meant by an utterance in a conversation, these are matters for the jury to decide. And the jury's decision of fact cannot be later appealed. So if the argument was heard at the first trial and the jury's verdict clearly implies that they came down on one side or the other of this argument, then you can't appeal the jury decision. You can only appeal points of law.
Okay, so in this case, we have to accept that the jury's judgment was that let him have it, Chris, meant shoot the police officer. But there's also a timing element here that's important, because if let him have it was in fact said, then it was said before Fairfax was shot. So this was the one that just sort of glanced, very, very slight graze. Fairfax at that point had Bentley under arrest for 15 or 20 minutes, certainly had hold of him, until Craig then shoots PC Sidney Miles in the head. So this is the gap between these two events. So there's a point of law here, because can a person who's under arrest, so Derek Bentley being held by Fairfax, can a person that's under arrest can still be part of a joint enterprise? Can they still be responsible for the actions of another person if they themselves are under arrest?
If Bentley is properly under arrest at the point that Miles was shot, what are the legal implications for the joint enterprise question? And there was an attempt by the defence to make something of this at trial, and it was raised at the initial appeal and as a point of law just after conviction. So let's just recap the sequence of events as best we can make out. So you've got Fairfax grabs Bentley. Bentley shouts, or doesn't shout, let him have it, Chris. Craig shoots Fairfax, who is very lightly wounded and falls to the ground. And Bentley stands there. So this might have been an opportunity to run and join Craig that he doesn't take. Fairfax gets up and grabs Bentley again. And there's a standoff across the rooftop as Fairfax uses Bentley as a sort of human shield. And then we have about 15 minutes or so pass, during which Craig fires some more shots over at Harrison on the other roof and generally into the air. And then you have PC Miles coming up through the staircase doorway and immediately is shot in the head. So you've got this 15 to 20 minutes where Bentley is certainly stood next to DC Fairfax, having been grabbed by him. Mm-hmm. So let's listen to the cross-examination where this is put to Bentley.
According to you, when you were over by the staircase head, you were not being held by the police officer. Is that right? That is right. So that you were not under arrest at the time. I was standing there, sir. But you were not being held. No.
So, Nicci, why is this important?
Here we've got Bentley, and let's not forget his learning disabilities, his quite sort of significant impairments. He's confused by an ambiguity here. It's a little bit unclear. We've got that of being under arrest and of being held. It seems that there's some kind of confusion here that's not quite clear. So he seems to take being held to mean being physically held onto, but the sort of legal meaning, it's a legal idiom. If someone's being held under arrest, that's what being held means. It means to be under arrest. So it has this other meaning. That's a legal status, which doesn't seem to be particularly clear to Bentley in this extract.
Okay, so this is obviously an important point in the trial, as the prosecution dwelt on it in their summing up of the evidence. So let's hear this extract from the prosecution's summing up.
Bentley will not have it. Bentley is saying that he was not being held, that he was free to get away.
One point here, Nicci, is why does it matter what Bentley thinks? Why does it matter what Bentley says? Surely there's a legal fact to the matter here. He was either under arrest or not.
Yeah, so it shouldn't really matter what he said. But there's complications around the law in this area because it had only fairly recently, only in 1947, had the law changed and made it so that if a person was to be under arrest, then they had to be told you were under arrest, and they had to have explained to them why they were under arrest. Prior to 1947, an officer grabbing you, that was enough. You were being held under arrest. So this is a fairly recent development. So this was clearly a point of law, and this was considered in the 1952 appeal. This question came up, was Bentley under arrest at the time PC Miles was shot by Craig? And then we've also got the questions of, if he was under arrest, then what are the implications of that?
Yeah, so let's look at the initial appeal from 1952. So there was a very rapid appeal after the conviction, and there were 2 points of appeal here. And they were that the judge did not sum up the case fairly and was biased. And it seems to me this is overwhelmingly true. He was egregiously biased, and I know it's not a historical record, but the 1991 film shows that really well. But the second point of appeal was that Bentley was under arrest. Because that was the case, the joint enterprise had to be finished. It had to be over at that point that he was arrested. Now, this ambiguity, so Bentley, we've heard, was asked in cross-examination whether he was being held. That might mean held under arrest, or it might mean being physically grabbed. It's not for the jury to decide that kind of ambiguity. The courts, the law, the appeal courts will decide this kind of what's the legal status of a person. It's a point of law, not a matter of fact. And here's what was said at that early appeal on this point.
It is a little difficult for Mr. Castles because his own client was asked specifically at the hearing whether he was under arrest at the time when this shot, which killed Miles, was fired. He would not have it. He said he had not been arrested, that he was not under arrest, that the police officer had not detained him, and all the rest of it.
Bentley's misunderstanding, so his confusion about what was meant by being held, contributed to the failure of that appeal. So the appeal court thinks that because Bentley said he wasn't being held under arrest, that's enough to say that he wasn't, in fact, under arrest. And that was, of course, very controversial. It was raised by a Labour MP and QC in the Houses of Parliament.
Mr. Humphreys, in opening a case for the Crown, had said Bentley was under arrest. Every policeman had said Bentley was under arrest. The fact beyond pre-adventure was that Bentley was under arrest. What did it matter what this near half-witted boy said as to being under arrest?
What happens next? At the trial, at the original trial rather than appeal, Christopher Craig was sentenced at Her Majesty's pleasure. It was very early in the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. And he, in fact, served just 10 years. So it was an indefinite sentence. He served 10 years and, from all accounts, lived the rest of his life as a model citizen. He expressed in the few interviews he gave his remorse for both the shooting of the police officer and for Derek Bentley's death. As we know, Derek was sentenced to death. This was required in law, but with their verdict, the jury of the time recommended clemency. And At that time, where a jury recommended clemency, more than 3/4 of death sentences were typically commuted to lesser sentences. So that recommendation of clemency ought to have carried a lot of weight. And the reasons why juries might recommend clemency could vary. It could include the youth of the condemned person, and Bentley was just 19. It could involve the condemned's cognitive capacity, which we've dwelt on. Mm-hmm. It could involve whether a sort of a principal co-conspirator had a lesser sentence, which was true in this case, and whether the condemned had directly participated in the murder.
All of which apply to Derek Bentley. But in spite of that, in spite of all the campaigns, all the letters and the petitions and so on, the questions in Parliament, as we've heard, and also there was a debate that was refused until after the sentence had been carried out. That seems a little bit pointless to have a debate after somebody has been hanged. But in spite of this, David Maxwell Fyfe, who was the Home Secretary, refused to recommend to the Queen clemency for Derek Bentley. And on the 28th of January 1953, Derek Bentley was executed.
So Bentley's family, and particularly Iris, his sister, campaigned throughout their lives for a posthumous pardon. And this came to a head in the 1998 appeal, which considered both the ambiguities that we've talked about.
They considered the meaning of let him have it, and they basically agreed that whether this was said and what it meant was a matter for the jury.
So as we've said, that couldn't really be appealed. It's not a matter for the appeal court.
Exactly.
However, on the ambiguity of whether Bentley was under arrest at the moment of the fatal shot, they considered what Bentley said at cross-examination and the look at the ambiguity around being held and what it meant, and whether what Bentley said was important to the point of law. And here's what they said.
The Crown case throughout was that the appellant was under arrest, or technically under arrest, which must mean the same thing, at the time when Police Constable Miles was shot, and it is very difficult to see how any answer given by the appellant could have any bearing on the legal question whether he was under arrest or not. We feel bound to say that, in our judgment, the Court of Criminal Appeal failed to grapple with this ground of appeal, which should have succeeded.
What they're saying there is that Bentley was indeed under arrest.
Yep.
So that means he couldn't have been part of the joint enterprise. So he couldn't have been part of the murder of PC Sidney Miles. On that basis, the 1998 appeal was successful. So Derek Bentley was finally posthumously pardoned 45 years after he was hanged. This was a year after his sister Iris, who had campaigned very hard throughout her life, so she didn't actually live to see the day that he received his pardon.
So Nicci, as we're reaching the end of this episode, what are your reflections about the 2 points we focused on, the points of ambiguity in this case?
I think that with the let him have it, I think I'm coming down on the side of it wasn't said, so it doesn't matter what in them, because it never happened. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I kind of agree. I think it's, yes, you can't appeal the facts of a jury. And I think if there's a flaw, John Paris might be right, it was in Derek's original defence team. Mm-hmm. They could have gone for the police account. If you read all the detail of the case, with the benefit of hindsight, you see all the holes in the police case that suggest it's a constructed case. And so I don't believe he said it either. So it's a sort of, it's not a point of ambiguity, but if it were, I think it's absolutely true. The jury has to decide.
And when it comes to being held, I think that certainly we would expect with a defendant like Bentley, if this happened today, that things would be explained a little bit more clearly, that if we had something that has got a widely used ordinary meaning, but then something very specific meaning within the legal context, I'd like to think that that would be explained a bit more clearly to a clearly vulnerable defendant. I think it's clear from his answers that he gave that what he thought about the situation doesn't really come into it. Was he or not? That's surely a yeah.
So again, yeah, it's almost like the let him have it. It doesn't matter what it means, because he didn't say it. With the whether he was being held, it doesn't matter what it means, because he doesn't determine whether he's under arrest or not. What he knows or doesn't know doesn't determine the case.
No.
And so both those ambiguities going against him led to him being hanged in 1953. Yeah. And in fact, neither ambiguity should have been important.
No.
And so that's where I come down at the end of the trial.
Yeah.
In the next episode, with the assistance of Professor Malcolm Coulthard, we'll be looking at the other linguistic evidence and principally at the 1998 appeal.
So Malcolm's language analysis provides us with evidence that Bentley's alleged confession statement, this was made at 5:30 a.m. This was the morning just after the shooting. Bentley, as we've heard, he couldn't read, he couldn't really sign his name. And actually, Professor Malcolm Coulthard's evidence amounts to these being not Bentley's words, actually, that there are features here that are sort of indicative potentially of a police register, and that the statement wasn't sort of produced in the way that the police had claimed, which was a sort of monologic, verbatim record of the information that Bentley volunteered at interview. And that's what 3 police officers swore to it being in court, but the linguistic evidence suggests otherwise. But we're going to get to that next time.
So in the meantime, if you've got a question, remember you can get in touch with the show via email, writingwrongs@aston.ac.uk.
If you've been affected by any of the themes in this week's episode, please consider contacting the resources in the episode description.
This has been Writing Wrongs, an original podcast series from the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics at Aston University. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Goodbye.